our people aren't here.
So just times every month, if everything is yeah. I tend to do like this semester and next semester I have to do 6 hours, and I haven't like I've contacted schools here and there, but they've been trying to get back to me. I'm trying to get into it just so just I can do 50 hours this semester. I'm like relaxed. It's like it's necessary because you have to go in there and like feel it out. But it's like I can do the thing about that is like if you go and if you go like for large chunks of time, like let's say you go for like the whole day, like just 2 or 3 times a week, but you go like
he works for the
and then yeah, it's spread out over 3 classes. 30 of them are for special ed, and then 10 for CI classes, and then 10 for project. Yeah, I had this class today. Mostly like classes like so far it's just just like how do we format I guess more very analytical and more like user friendly, which really is like it's an exercise in itself. It's no easy task to like determine what's important and like what you can spread.
No, that's what she's like. That's what it is.
Because they buy the most textbooks.
So I think you can stand there, you can stand
That's horrifying to me. Like, well, one day, some of them took checks and ideas, not like a God theory, Christian myth, and then other things about saying like that slavery wasn't that bad. And it's really like, especially like sometimes I really like you've went to university, you've read a lot, you're not serious. This is not being credited. Is that next one?
Try to have some kind of sparring.
Did he even like, was it like public debate? Did he ever teach her? And it can be just one on whatever platform you feel supported by another But that's because like
Sort of feel
it really kind of comes down to what's
Okay, it doesn't mean.
just like any other most class.
Yeah, I just don't know this like right away. So this is talking
Probably including that.
Hello and welcome to the Institute for Humanities. I think we'll get started on this frosty cold day. Thanks so much for coming. I am the Associate Director, Linda Bobber, and I want to make a couple programming announcements before our program starts. We have a couple things coming up that you might be interested in. On February 17th, we're hosting a conversation with Syed Yeshua and Todd Lacey in the series Thinking Outside of the Box on Israel-Palestine. That will be at 4 p.m. on February 17th. And the Fellows Lecture after today's talk will be by Gosha Fidelis, who's here on March 5th, and 4 p.m. titled The 60s Behind the Iron Curtain, Youth Culture and the Search for Freedom in Poland in the Global 60s. So we hope to see you back again for that history lecture. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Marina Mohilner, the Edward and Mariana Staten Chair in Russian and East European Intellectual History.
Thank you. And I'm very glad to present Melissa Hibbard, who is a fellow, graduate fellow at the Institute, and who is a graduate student of my colleague, Professor Kili Stavithausek, who unfortunately can't be here today. And she asked me to introduce Melissa, and I'm very glad and I'm proud to do this. Not only because I'm in Melissa's dissertation committee, not because I know her work well, not because Melissa's academic CV is unusually rich for someone at such an early stage of her academic career. So Melissa has almost all major fellowships in our field, and she participated in many conferences, she gave many guest lectures. But the main reason why I'm so glad to introduce Melissa is the quality of her work and the innovative nature of her dissertation research. The topic of Melissa's dissertation, in my view, opens up a new research agenda for East European historians. Her dissertation is going to be the first comprehensive study of child welfare policies in interwar Poland. Melissa studies history of child welfare in Poland as an expression of, as a vehicle of nation building. And here I'm quoting from one of her writings, when the state itself was being imagined, envisioned, and contested. So her dissertation is not a typical political history. And this is not also an institutional history of the state. This is not a traditional study of state institutions, of welfare state institutions. This is something that I would define, or I'm trying to explain this to myself, as a social history of a state. The study of professional discourses, professional practices, all kinds of social and professional initiatives and networks that together defined this scenario for this new emerging Polish state. They together acted as a state. And to me, this is probably the most exciting part of Melissa's project, because it actually helps us to relativize the ideas of a state and a nation, the ideas that of a fair state, the ideas that we tend to take for granted. So this approach in and by itself is very important, is very new, but also Melissa pushes it further by focusing on this interwar period in Poland as a kind of post-imperial moment when the old imperial diversity persists, when you still have the diversity of ethnicities, of historical memories, of social formations, and when you observe this very interesting moment when this diversity meet the challenge from universalizing discourses, nationalizing state, modernizing state. So this is indeed a very interesting moment. Milica is trying to write this very complex, non-linear narrative. She is using historical sources in Polish, Yiddish, and German languages, and the kind of sources that she was able to locate in Polish archives are also sources that are little known to historians. So we have another graduate student writing his dissertation in Polish history, Michal, who is here, and between them they really create a new field in Polish studies, in East European studies. So I hope that in her talk today entitled Child Rescue and the Politics of Cultural Integration, Milica will be able to present the whole complexity of her project, and I invite you to share your comments, to ask questions during Q&A session. Thank you very much, and the pleasure.
Thank you, Marina, for that introduction. It's always so wonderful to hear your work reflected back to you so eloquently in someone else's words. First of all, I'd also like to thank the Institute for this opportunity. So far, it's been such a wonderful and productive year for me. To Sue, the director, who's not here, to Linda and the staff, who thankfully are always here. And to my fellows, it's such a gift for me to be part of this intellectual community, and I've really benefited from it so far. And finally, to everyone for being here. It's great to see so many familiar faces. In 1917, on the Eastern Front, large urban areas of German and Austrian territory were in crisis. Food and fuel were scarce, and unemployment and inflation were on the rise. In the middle of this territory lay Warsaw, which was feeling the crushing blows of wartime poverty. This most populated city of German-occupied Polish lands was, by 1917, gripped with disease and starvation, and much of the population was hovering on the brink of existence. It was in this context that the Central Welfare Council, in Polish, the Rada Główna Opiekuńcza, or RGO, you can see the name listed down there, put out a call to the farmers and farm wives of the Polish countryside to open their hearts and their homes in order to save the children of Warsaw. It was an appeal to recruit hosts for the RGO's program called Countryside for the Children, which sought to rescue urban children from starvation by relocating them in farms in outlying districts. By 1917, it had placed over 5,000 children in rural settings, but wanted homes for as many as 100,000 more. Now, to achieve this, the RGO attempted to convince rural population of their deep ties to Warsaw and the fate of its children. Farmers and farm wives, the plea began. The prices of grain and potatoes have been rising, you know this well, but you do not feel it as those who must buy everything that they cook. For you, it is easier to live. When the rural people in their own time sought refuge in Warsaw, she, our mother, embraced you all, created a shelter, cared for your children, and comforted you. And now it is your turn, farmer and farm wife. The whole country of Poland looks to you and carefully takes note of how you behave and if you will rescue the children of Warsaw. According to the RGO, rural population should rush to accept urban children with open arms, as we see here in this image, not just as a good act of Christian charity, but because Warsaw, the capital city of all of Poland, called to them for help, entrusting with them the rescue of an entire country. Now, what's noteworthy about this is that in 1917, the country in question here, Poland, doesn't exist as an independent state, nor had it for 122 years. What's more, many of the people who this appeal was talking to, that is, rural inhabitants of former Russian Poland, would have been rather uninclined to think of Warsaw as having any major importance in their lives, and they would not have been immediately sold about the idea of restoring an independent Polish state. Therefore, for the RGO to ask rural communities to take on the burden of extra children who were far from beyond the boundaries of their own communities, in the midst of their own wartime shortages and labor shortages, food shortages and labor shortages, and for the good of what Robert Blombaum has called the imagined capital of a non-existent state, this was a bold move, but not an uncalculated one. Today I'm going to talk about two programs run by the RGO. The first is the child evacuation scheme called Countryside for the Children, and the second is a massive fundraising campaign called Save the Children. Taken together, they show how the RGO, in the absence of any sovereign nation state, attempted to enact child welfare on an imagined countrywide or national scale. And through these two programs, I want to demonstrate how the idea of Poland, a potentially, hopefully, soon-to-be independent country, was leveraged to get people involved in acts of child rescue, and in turn, how involvement in those acts of rescuing Polish children was seen as a way to foster greater urban-rural solidarity and encourage the growth of national consciousness in provincial areas. In these rescue schemes, the social category of the Polish child, both in body and metaphor, functions as a symbol of potential state and national unity that cuts across class, geographic, and cultural boundaries. Now, before I proceed, I should briefly mention that the talk I'm giving today, as Marina mentioned, is part of a larger dissertation work in progress that looks at the intersection of children, social care, and state formation in Poland between 1914 and 1939. And the piece I'm talking about today comes out of the first chapter, which considers how forms of social care for children rapidly developed during the First World War, and set the stage, I think, for the development of a more modern welfare apparatus after Polish independence was achieved in 1918. It's widely acknowledged in literature on World War I that the Great War brought an increased focus to children and their needs across Europe and North America. After the war, many countries passed protective legislation for children and increasingly recognized them as the future citizens of the state. The same holds true for Poland, but what I think makes it a fruitful case study is that unlike other liberal democracies of the Americas and Western Europe, in Poland, children were thrust into the forefront of public concerns at the very moment when the state itself was being imagined, envisioned, and contested. It's precisely this type of messy founding moment that sociologist Lynn Haney and historian Lisa Pollard have said needs to be looked at in greater detail. Haney and Pollard have called for a renewed and expanded approach between the links to the links between state and family that include looking at areas and time periods where there's no autonomous welfare state, such as during colonial expansion or, in my case, after the collapse of imperial structures. And I'm hoping that my work with this chapter can help answer that call. And also, her work on everyday life in Vienna during the First World War, Maureen Healy has argued that inattention to civic needs helped contribute to the fall of the Habsburg Empire. And I guess with this first chapter, I'm trying to flip that and ask, how did attention to civic needs help shape elements of the nascent European successor states that formed after the war? Now, in order for us to understand what the RGO was doing and why it was new, we need to get a sense for what was the state of social care in Polish lands before World War I. (1795) had marked the end of the First Polish Republic, leaving its territory, as you can see here, divided between the Prussian, Austrian, and Russian empires. During this era of partition, which lasted until the First World War, the occupying authorities paid little to no attention to matters of social welfare, leaving those tasks to fall heavily on voluntary organizations, charities, and religious orders. And although the end of the 19th century saw considerable growth in relation to activity with children and youth, restrictions placed on voluntary associations, especially in the Russian partition, the red part over there, drove much of this activity underground and limited its focus to a rather local scale. Now, that changed significantly during the First World War. The German and Austrian occupations that took place in 1915 opened up new opportunities for Polish-run self-help in the former Russian-controlled territory. So, during the first year of World War I, this was still controlled by the Russian Empire. But in 1915, the Austrian and German armies pushed them back. Germany occupied this blue part here, and Austria occupied the light green. On December 12, 1915, an act of the German occupying authorities allowed Poles to create the RGO, again, the Central Welfare Council. It was an organization run by Poles for Poles to bring aid to all people, informs to all people harmed by the war. And even though a Polish state did not yet exist, this increased autonomy in the welfare sphere allowed the RGO to begin experimenting with operations that on a more imagined national scale than was possible before. Although Polish language scholarship refers to the RGO as a philanthropic or a charity or a social care organization, I would argue that the scope and the nature of its activities make it much more analogous to a system of public welfare or public social care than anything that was run by the Poles up until this point. Through its several departments, which included departments of finance, economy, reconstruction, and child welfare, and its extensive network of county and municipal care councils, the RGO utilized funds from the occupying German government, the various wartime self-help committees that were located around this area, and private contributions to bring aid to all corners of the Polish kingdom. The RGO's Department of Child Welfare is also noteworthy. It was the first of its kind to exist among any wartime aid council in Poland or Polish territory. And the department sought to liberate child welfare from its child care from its narrow philanthropic past and link it to larger issues of state and society. A central proponent of this mission was a pediatrician named Władysław Szczeniak, who in 1916 wrote that care for children is social work and therefore should not be a philanthropic, but rather a social responsibility. Child welfare should not be regarded as an act of goodwill, but as a responsibility of the whole nation, for the future and the well-being of society depend on it. So while the RGO pursued the biological rescue of the young, its implications and motivations for that rescue amounted to much more than just saving the lives of tiny humans. It was concerned with the preservation and construction of a country for Poland, whatever that might end up looking like after the war. So now that we've gained a sense of the RGO and its work within the context of the war and the recent partitions, I want to move on to talking about the two specific programs of child rescue. Historian Karen Dubinsky has identified the child as a social category that is, quote, at once real and metaphorical, powerful as a cultural construct, but equally forceful in flesh and blood. And the programs I'm talking about today utilized in their symbolic politics the flesh and blood child, as well as the idea or the image of a Polish child to mobilize and unify people around a common cause, Poland and its future. First, I want to address the program that dealt directly with the living children, Countryside for the Children. And starting in 1915 and lasting into the early years of statehood, until the RGO operated until 1920, so it lasted the first couple of years of the Polish Republic. Countryside for the Children put urban children in rural homes to be brought up by temporary guardians until their parents' economic status improved. To give you a sense of how this ideally unfolded, I want to draw on the fictional account of one family that was published in an RGO booklet in 1918 called How the Village Rescued Urban Children. We see here a poor, unnamed mother in the streets of Warsaw. Her husband has been in the army for 3 years and she's out of work, completely destitute. And one day she's out begging with her two older children, Stash and Mania. And a passerby leans in, but instead of offering a bit of change, he whispers a piece of advice to her. Go to the RGO's main office on Jasna 32 and you'll find assistance. So she goes and she hears about all the RGO has to offer, including a program called Countryside for the Children. After the initial intake interview where the RGO staff asked her about her life and her economic situation, a doctor examines her children and confirms that they are in fact in poor enough health to be sent out to the countryside. They're vaccinated for smallpox and then told to wait for their departure date. On the day of departure, the children are dispatched in groups of 25 to 30, accompanied by an RGO chaperone sitting there in the white hat. Their travel paid for by the RGO with a discount one-way ticket. Upon arrival at their destination, representatives of the local councils, usually members of the clergy or landed gentry, would then oversee placement of children into the homes of small land-owning farmers, włościanie in Polish. The RGO presents the journey to the countryside as happy and exciting for the children who, upon arrival, were met by farmers and farmwives, offered their own little corner in the cottage, and given a piece of big homemade bread. The idealized scenario is that children benefited from all the sun and food and life-giving qualities that the countryside had to offer. Here we see Stash and Mania on a sunny golden afternoon, taking a break from work for an afternoon snack. When the summer ends and school time approaches, Stash and Manya are returned to Warsaw, healthy, ruddy, and happy. They answer their mother's million questions as she weeps tears of joy and asks God to bless and reward the honorable farmers who rescued her children from the grave and returned them to her in good health and humor. It sounds great, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to send their kids out for a summer in the countryside to save them from certain death? But, as we know, things in history rarely work out this easily. This story contains a number of misleading elements that I can't fully address in the time here, but suffice to say, a child's stay was often much longer than a couple of months, sometimes lasting as many as 2, 3, 4 years. It was actually quite difficult for parents to get their children back. They had to be approved by the RGO after a home inspection. They had to pay for return train tickets or go get their children themselves. And even then, there was such poor communication between the district councils and the main RGO office in Warsaw that oftentimes they lost track of children altogether, and parents couldn't even find out where their kid was located. But for the purposes of today, I want to discuss how this program was promoted among and perceived by rural communities. From 1915 to 1920, Countryside for the Children placed over 11,000 children in rural homes and shelters. And I have sort of an incomplete Google map here that I've been putting together as I work through the documents that gives you a sense of the range of this operation. So the sending communities are located here in red, the main one being Warsaw, but also Łódź, Częstochowa, and Sosnowiec. And then all the blue areas are the seats of county care councils where children were sent to, and then from there they'd be distributed into homes around the area. Now, what were the mechanics of the RGO's attempts to convince rural populations to accept urban children? Well, first there was an attempt to frame the urban or Warsaw child as a more generic Polish child. And I see this shift happening all over the RGO documents. They're increasingly emphasizing the necessity of this action to save Poland's vanishing youngest generation, the future of the country. Second, RGO told rural populations that they had something unique to offer. The RGO has money from public charity to help poor people, read one of their requests, but it does not possess farmhouses and fields for poor children so desperately need them to stay in the countryside. Third, the RGO lobbied rural hosts through the angles of love and family and maternal bonds. The RGO asked farm wives to feel the struggle of a Warsaw mother with a maternal heart and accept at least 1 or 2 of her innocent children into their homes. When urban parents and children had to go through the process of interviews and medical examinations in order to qualify for the program, all farmers had to do was be informally recognized by clergy or gentry as being of good means and culture, and sign a document attesting that they would honestly and lovingly care for the child as their own. The RGO reports speak to genuine love and warmth that rural hosts developed for their charges, and cited how neither children nor adults wanted the stay to end. And in fact, they say that some children reportedly began preferring their rural host family to their biological family back in Warsaw. Now, this could be interpreted as one of the unintended consequences of a child relocation program, or it could be read as one of the possible intended benefits for rural-urban integration. Scholars have argued that in the 1950s, American participation in child rescue of Korean and Chinese children through donations and adoption served to personalize U.S.-Asia relations in terms of familial love, thereby making adoption an effective means to fight the Cold War. By endearing the rural family and the urban child to each other through the bonds of familial love, the RGO could effectively unify city and village in a very deep, personal way. Finally, the RGO tried to tap into peasants' own sense of history, values, and traditions, and then combine them with newer tropes of civic responsibility. The RGO praised rural populations as hospitable and generous, and reminded them of the old Polish saying, "Guest in the home, God in the home." But with that, it talked also about hosting children not as an act of charity, but rather as a noble duty, a civic responsibility. That booklet that I mentioned, How the Village Saved Urban Children, in that the RGO made a deliberate move to appeal to the farmers as the citizens of Piast, Poland. That was the ruling dynasty from the late 900s to 1340. And for members of a rural audience, especially in Russian Poland, who were constantly worried about the reinstatement of serfdom, Referencing the Piast dynasty spoke to a time when they were not serfs. It connected their civic responsibility with a Poland that would not solely consist of noble privilege, but also respected and embraced the peasantry. Now, I have reasons to question the effectiveness of all of these approaches, as I can see in the documents plenty of pushback to the unloading of poor urban children in rural communities. First of all, we see that this notion of the generic Polish child starts to break down in actual practice. Clothing was in great demand during the war, and according to an RGO report, the foster guardian, a peasant, does not want to acquire clothing at his own cost, thinking that he already does a lot when he gives the child something to eat. Regional care councils also didn't want to have to provide the children with clothing, claiming that they had their own local children to help. Even the Warsaw City Council didn't want to send clothing to Warsaw's children out in the countryside, saying they had no way of knowing whether or not these were the offspring of deserving Warsaw residents. Similar conflicts emerged over schooling. Many village authorities limited relocated children's access to local education, saying that rural schools were for rural children. Many peasant guardians of the RGO were unwilling to pay school fees for a, quote, foreign child, and they used the word obcy, which doesn't denote foreign in Polish. While the RGO framed rural hosting as a fulfillment of civic responsibility, I think many peasant families understood this as a simple labor exchange. They accepted a child without payment, agreed to feed them, and in return they got free labor for the farm. I've mentioned already some of the effects that the war had on urban settings, but let's not forget that the rural areas were also feeling very strapped. Peasant men made up the majority of Poles that had been drafted into Russian and Austro-Hungarian armies, leaving women and children behind to shoulder the burdens of tending to the field. And in the absence of any monetary relief from the RGO, getting extra hands on the farm would have been really the only tangible benefit of accepting an extra child. The RGO tried to put a positive spin on child labor, presenting it as the child's willing and grateful repayment of their host's generosity. Remember little Stosh sitting out in the field? Well, supposedly farmers marveled at how quickly and easily this little urban worm took to farm work. In reality, the RGO received several complaints that urban children were not in fact good farm workers. By 1918, shocking, yeah. By 1918, the RGO believed that rural communities had grown tired of accepting new charges because they were fed up with urban children's aversion to chores and housework. What's more is they were not always grateful house guests. Urban parents expressed a lot of suspicion about sending their children out to be raised by a chłop, the pejorative term for peasant. And apparently children also absorbed this prejudice, as farm families complained about the arrogance shown to them by urban children and their parents. The consequence of these resentments for the program was that children often were sent back. Children were sent back to Warsaw for a variety of reasons, including they weren't the right age to work, the harvest was over, they grew ill, sick kids don't make for good farm labor, or they didn't have clothes. In fact, in 1916, a priest from the village of Kosova told staff in the Warsaw RGO office that they could all go to hell for pawning off barefoot, half-naked children on his community. So to sum up, we see here that the notion of Poland's children as a category that transcended social and cultural boundaries was not yet that well established. Provincial authorities and families still felt most beholden to help their own children, and their own children was defined as those who were full and permanent residents of the local community. Despite RGO efforts, children placed in rural communities could still be perceived as Warszawski, Varsovian, miejski, urban, or even obcy, foreign. So we've talked now about the program that dealt most directly with the flesh and blood child, and now I'd like to switch to my second program, the Save the Children fundraising campaign, which had a much less direct impact on the living child, but still attempted to unify the whole country, and that's their language that they use, around the symbolic cause of the Polish child. Save the Children began in 1916 and ran until 1920, and it was one of the largest actions organized by the RGO. It was a week-long event held every June and involved public collections of money, performances, celebration, as well as special lectures and publications. And it was conceived of as an ogólnokrajowy event, a whole country event. Giving to Save the Children was described not as charity, but as a citizen's tribute to the great work of rescuing our youngest generations. Now, to drive home this point in practice, the RGO designed Save the Children fundraising week to function according to the principles of saturation, celebration, simultaneity, uniformity, and inclusiveness. By saturation, I refer to the RGO's attempts to fill as many communities as possible with as many people as possible collecting money. In fact, the omnipresent collectionnaire has been described as one of the campaign's most important elements. In cities, collectors would stand on street corners or outside churches, and in villages they would actually go door to door soliciting collections. Passers-by could donate, and in return they would get a little stamp or a badge like we see here as a token of their donation, which then further served to advertise the cause to anyone else who they encountered that day, like a little "I voted" sticker. In addition to the actual collection itself, the week took on a tone of celebration, becoming a full-blown week of special events, theater performances, the sale of flowers on streets, raffles, food, orchestras, choir performances. In some rural communities, the RGO reported that Save the Children collection days transformed into national celebrations with banners, processions, and patriotic songs. And this is exactly what the RGO organizers wanted to see happen. One RGO worker, Wacław Janasz, reported that he hoped these celebrations would inspire other villages to have a more patriotic spirit and eventually repent and submit themselves to the collection effort. To cement the collection as a whole country action, the RGO stressed its desire for simultaneity and uniformity. The RGO wanted this collection to happen for the same 7 days in all areas across all of Poland with the same material and the same general character. In 1917, when the RGO successfully spread this effort to the Austrian-occupied territory, so like I said, the RGO is operating in this light blue, but in 1917 they spread Save the Children to the Austrian occupation. They agreed with the Central Care Committee operating there that the campaign would take place in both territories at the exact same time, using the exact same posters, emblems, mottos, and regulations. Unlike Countryside for the Children, which only served Polish Christians, Save the Children tried to cast an even wider social net. The RGO told provincial councils that this was the first countrywide effort to raise money for children, and therefore it should truly encompass the entire country, including all social classes, regardless of faith, views, and material position. And that's their language there. Regional subcommittees were supposed to include clergy and teachers and farmers, as well as, quote, individual representatives from all social classes in their collection efforts. And this fit with the RGO's position generally, that aid work should involve the widest representation of society possible and bring together people from all different backgrounds to work for a common cause. In terms of faith and ethnicity, the collection made at least modest attempts to reach out beyond the boundaries of Polish-speaking Roman Catholics. The image that we see here, which was used in the 1916 and 1917 campaigns, is arguably a very Christian one. We have an angel and children knelt down praying at her feet. This image was tweaked a little bit and was grafted on to a Star of David as a sign of the RGO's attempts to reach out to potential Jewish donors. Janasz complained, however, that neither Jews, save a few notable exceptions, nor the German colonists, his language, not mine, showed much involvement in the campaign. And this doesn't really come to me as a big surprise because many of these suffering urban areas that are constantly referenced, despite being 1/3 to 1/2 Jewish, in those the RGO was not distributing funds really in any proportion like that to Jewish institutions. Maybe once or maybe occasionally a Jewish institution would get funds, but by and large these were going to fund Polish Christian children. Specifically in regard to rural communities, Save the Children took on a sixth characteristic: education. The RGO saw the campaign as an opportunity to, quote, direct the thoughts of peasants towards the future of the country, end quote, at a time when occupying authorities were competing for their loyalties. Care Council collectors, or instructors as they were sometimes referred to, would come to town accompanied by a lot of fanfare and begin soliciting donations. Then, with perhaps not so smooth a sleight of hand, they would start distributing literature and holding public lectures about Polish culture and history. The collection also provided information for the RGO. Aside from going the goal of collecting as many donations from as wide a group as possible, its second explicit goal was to, quote, ascertain the general mood in all parts of society around the country. The RGO believed that through the registers of names of people who gave what, that they could tell which areas, right down to the specific village, cottage, and family, quote, shared in this national social manifestation. So just as we discussed with Countryside for the Children, local care councils often failed to enact the Save the Children campaign in a way that really fully matched with the RGO's vision. At these educational lectures that accompanied the collection days, peasants would sometimes leave saying that they didn't really care to hear about Poland. A skilled lecturer could keep their attention by switching to more concrete topics like RGO activity, defense of certain cities during the war against invading armies, maybe something as mundane as planting potatoes, and then circle back around to what he was really there to discuss, the meaning of the May 3rd Constitution in 1791. Some rural residents doubted donations were actually going to help needy children. Rumors circulated that money given for children was instead going to support a new king who would immediately reinstate serfdom. Other times, peasants denied collectors access to their homes or refused to sign their names on the list, fearing it would lead to incarceration by the Polish legions. Certain peasant youths enrolled to collect donation refused to give out the specially prepared stamps containing the image of the white eagle, a Polish national symbol. And one county just flat out ignored the RGO's instructions and raised funds under the banner of Save the Children to support their own local needs. These protests and modifications of Save the Children on a local level, I think, speak to a persistent fear among peasants in former Russian Poland about the reinstatement of serfdom, its conscription into the army, and also a healthy skepticism about an independent Polish state that would be run by kings and noblemen. I think it elucidates what Jan Molenda, a Polish historian, has described as burgeoning local or homeland consciousness among many peasant communities that was not yet synonymous with a desire for an ideological homeland, i.e. an independent Polish state. The RGO, however, read resistance and non-compliance in the collection effort as a sign of cultural backwardness, lack of education, and an underdeveloped Polish national consciousness and civic spirit. The antidote for this, it argued, was continued exposure to the mutually supporting forces of education and social care. Increased social activity in the provinces, the RGO believed, could create a certain culture among the lud, or the people. And that's specifically what they talk about, a certain culture among the people that made them more curious and receptive to thinking about the well-being of a Polish nation. The RGO's attempts to convince villagers to accept responsibility for the needs of children outside their community represented a major shift in social care during the Great War. Before that, social activity had operated on a rather limited and local scale. If one gave money to poor children, they, at least in the donors' minds, expected that to be going to children from their own community. The war changed all of this, making children emerge as a new priority for the whole country, even before that country was a formal reality. But as we've seen, the Polish child, as it's promoted in RGO discourse, was in practice referring to a much more limited child population. And that population was primarily urban, working class, and non-Jewish. There was essentially no discussion within the RGO about the needs of rural children, who would comprise the majority of the child population in inner-rural Poland. Aspects of integration, then, came not through aid administered to all children regardless of background, but through a conscious engagement, the conscious engagement of broad swaths of adult society on behalf of children. Through its programs, the RGO was trying to forge a common culture of childcare as a way to get people from rural areas involved in the work of building a Poland that could survive as an independent nation state. Through a more expanded system of child welfare, the hopeful state builders of the RGO saw opportunities to foster greater rural-urban solidarity and test the spread of national consciousness in provincial areas, all in the name of Polish children. But, as it turns out, it's difficult to enact something in the name of unity that doesn't socially or culturally yet exist. For some peasants, it was not war damages or poverty that made them reluctant to participate in the Save the Children fundraising campaign, but it was instead the very national character of the campaign itself. They weren't comfortable giving money for children that they couldn't see, in the name of a country that they may or may not have identified fully with. Nor were they willing to take on arrogant or uppity urban children that proved to be a drain rather than a contribution to the home economy. The RGO's mission to create a common culture of childcare that transcended deep class, cultural, and geographic boundaries within Polish society, however ambitious, would unfortunately remain incomplete and unrealized during the organization's tenure. That impulse, however, did not end with the RGO, but would instead be picked up in the coming years by many other professional experts, statesmen, and organizations in independent Poland. So stay tuned, that's what the rest of my dissertation is about. Thank you.